Imagine a world where the color of your skin determined your fate, where entire communities were torn from their homes and forced into a life of unimaginable suffering. This was the reality of European Atlantic slavery, a system designed not just for profit, but to dehumanize and control millions of Africans. Unlike other forms of slavery in human history, this was distinctly racial, born from a belief that certain people were inherently meant to be enslaved. Women, and even children, were captured, separated from their families, and thrust into a cruel system that treated human life as a commodity. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare that few survived. Packed tightly into ships with barely enough room to sit, enslaved people endured sweltering heat, disease, hunger, and the constant threat of violence. They were stripped of their names, their possessions, their dignity, and often their sense of hope. The physical suffering was immense, but the psychological torment, knowing that your life had been stolen and that you were at the mercy of strangers, was even more harrowing. Yet amid this darkness, there were moments of courage, resilience, and resistance. Africans found ways to communicate, to support each other, and in some cases, to revolt against the oppressors. Stories of bravery on slave ships remind us that even in the face of overwhelming cruelty, the human spirit can endure and resist. These are not just tales of suffering, they are testimonies to strength, unity, and defiance against injustice. Understanding this history is crucial. It forces us to confront the deep scars left by slavery, not only in Africa and the Americas, but across the world. It challenges us to reflect on the consequences of dehumanization and the enduring impact of racial prejudice. By remembering the stories of those who endured the Middle Passage, we honor their lives and recognize their struggles as a pivotal part of our collective history. If you find this story as compelling as we do, make sure to support our channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. Every like and subscription helps us continue to share these important stories, preserving the voices of those who history tried to silence. Join us on this journey through history, as we explore the untold experiences, the lessons learned, and the human stories behind the statistics of slavery. Stay with us, and let us uncover the truth together. As the captives were forced aboard the massive wooden vessels, the reality of the journey that awaited them became immediately apparent. The Middle Passage, the treacherous voyage from Africa to the Americas, stretched anywhere from 1 to 3 months, a period defined by relentless suffering, suffocating conditions, and the omnipresent shadow of death. Each ship was meticulously packed to maximize profit, leaving little space for movement. And in these confines, humanity itself seemed to be stripped away. Women and children were crammed together below decks, their bodies chained in pairs, with barely enough room to sit upright, let alone stretch or find comfort. The air was thick with stench, a heavy, suffocating mixture of sweat, human waste, unwashed bodies, and the constant fear that permeated every corner of the ship. The oppressive heat, often exceeding what the human body could tolerate, left many in a state of near delirium, while the humidity turned every breath into a struggle, every inhale a reminder of their helplessness. Illness spread like wildfire in these tightly packed holds, unchecked and merciless, claiming lives with frightening speed. Yours. Dysentery and fevers swept through the human cargo, leaving the sick helpless and often beyond aid. In some cases, those who fell gravely ill were cast into the ocean, their bodies used to satisfy the cold calculations of insurance policies or the brutal economics of human trade. Starvation was another constant companion on these voyages, as food rations were deliberately minimal, often spoiled, and shared among hundreds of souls, leaving many to weaken, succumb to disease, or lose the will to survive. Thirst was equally tormenting, with fresh water running dangerously low during long stretches of the journey, forcing the captives to drink brackish water that only worsened their suffering. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical. The despair of being torn from one's homeland, the anguish of losing family members to disease or violence, and the constant uncertainty of life or death created an atmosphere where fear and hopelessness became all-encompassing. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, many Africans found ways to hold on to their identities, traditions, and humanity. Secretly, they would whisper songs of their villages, pass messages through subtle gestures, or maintain rituals that reminded them of who they were before the chains. These acts of quiet defiance were fleeting but powerful, offering small bursts of resilience amid relentless cruelty. On some occasions, entire groups planned revolts, attempting to reclaim agency in a world that sought to erase it, while the odds were overwhelmingly against them. These acts of resistance were profound statements of courage, signaling that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit would not be fully extinguished. Life on the ship was also marked by extreme brutality inflicted by the crew, who wielded whips, iron bars, and other implements to maintain control. Any attempt to resist, whether through conversation, subtle movements, or open rebellion, was met with violence designed to instill terror. Children, often too young to understand the full scope of their predicament, suffered immensely, subjected to the same horrors as adults, and yet their presence highlighted the enduring bonds of family and community even in separation. Families were often torn apart immediately upon capture, but the recognition of familiar faces or shared lineage provided fragile threads of comfort and connection, moments of solace that punctuated the otherwise unbroken rhythm of suffering. The relentless motion of the ocean added another layer of torment. Rough seas and storms battered the vessels, tossing bodies in chains and worsening the already perilous conditions below deck. The sounds of the ship creaking timbers, the splash of waves against the hull, cries of the ill, and the occasional orders from the crew created a cacophony of terror that could be deafening, unrelenting, and inescapable. Nights offered no reprieve. The darkness below decks was absolute, and sleep was often impossible for those crammed in suffocating rows, chained in positions that left them vulnerable to injury or abuse. Even those above deck, who occasionally received brief glimpses of open sky, were not spared from the fear and anxiety that gripped the entire vessel, aware that at any moment, disease, violence, or accidents could claim another life. The Middle Passage was a crucible of human suffering, where countless lives were lost and countless others were irreparably scarred. Yet, amid this suffering, stories of solidarity, defiance, and survival emerged. Captives shared what little they had, supported one another in sickness, and found ways to communicate despite the language barriers intentionally enforced by their captors. They maintained hope in whispers, in songs, in quiet acts of resistance, creating a lifeline that, for some, was the difference between life and death. The journey across the Atlantic was not only a physical passage but a test of endurance, resilience, and the ability to retain a sense of self in a system designed to strip it away. By the time the ships approached the shores of the Americas, those who survived were forever changed. Bodies were weakened, spirits tested, and identities challenged. Yet the legacy of the Middle Passage persisted not just in the statistics of death, but in the stories of courage, resistance, and humanity that endured. It is a chapter of history that reveals the depths of human cruelty, but also the indomitable strength of those who faced it, reminding us of the power of memory, the importance of storytelling, and the necessity of acknowledging the truth of the past in order to understand the present. Long before the first cries of enslaved Africans echoed through the holds of the ships, The triangular trade had already begun to shape the course of continents, economies, and lives. European merchants, driven by the lure of wealth and the promise of power, set their sights on Africa, sending vessels laden with textiles, firearms, metal goods, and other commodities to the western coast, where African rulers, traders, and local intermediaries engaged in complex systems of commerce, negotiation, and, at times, coercion. In coastal forts and marketplaces, goods were exchanged for human lives, and entire families were torn from villages under the pretext of trade, conflict, or debt, marking the start of a journey that would carry them far from their homeland. The system was meticulously designed, a web of economic calculation and human suffering that allowed European powers to extract resources and labor with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that every voyage contributed to the accumulation of wealth in distant ports of Europe. Once the African captives were aboard, the ships embarked on the infamous Middle Passage, the brutal voyage across the Atlantic that would define the enslaved experience for generations. Below decks, bodies pressed together in iron chains endured months of oppressive heat, disease, and despair. While above, the ship's crew navigated treacherous waters and sought to maintain order through intimidation and violence. These journeys were not mere transfers of human cargo. They were calculated operations, where every decision from rationing food and water to the placement of shackles was measured against profit margins and the grim realities of mortality. The vessels themselves became microcosms of control, with the crew exercising absolute authority over every aspect of life and death, while the enslaved, despite their dire circumstances, sought moments of resistance, solidarity, and survival. Stories of mutinies, secret communications, and quiet defiance remind us that even in the depths of such oppression, human agency persisted, flickering like a candle in the darkness of the Atlantic nights. Arrival in the Americas did not mark freedom, but rather a transition into yet another system of exploitation. The enslaved Africans were sold at markets, often after being cleaned, oiled, and displayed to enhance their value, a dehumanizing ritual that reduced them to commodities in the eyes of buyers. Plantations and households in the Caribbean, North America, and South America awaited their labor, each with its own brutal routines and expectations. Yet even in these foreign lands, the echoes of their origins, the rhythms of their cultures, and the bonds formed during the Middle Passage persisted, influencing music, language, religion, and social structures, and forming the backbone of communities that would endure against the odds. This flow of human and material capital completed the triangular route. Raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee were shipped back to European ports, fueling industries, enriching merchants, and cementing a global system that intertwined wealth with human suffering in ways that would resonate for centuries. The triangular trade was not simply a matter of economics. It was an intricate system that entwined politics, power, and human lives. European nations competed fiercely for dominance, establishing colonies, fortresses, and trade agreements that often involved violence, diplomacy, and manipulation of local African dynamics. The human cost was staggering, not only for those who were captured, but for entire communities whose social fabrics were disrupted, whose generations were decimated, and whose histories were rewritten by the relentless machinery of commerce. Every bale of cotton, every crate of sugar, and every shipment of goods carried the weight of lost lives, suffering, and cultural dislocation, creating a chain of consequences that extended far beyond the immediate transaction. The Middle Passage and the triangular trade were inseparable components of a system that codified racial hierarchies, justified exploitation, and laid the foundation for enduring inequalities that persisted long after slavery itself was legally abolished. Within the ships and across the oceans, life became a precarious balance between survival and despair. Captives clung to each other, whispered songs of memory, and sought solace in shared identities, while crew members navigated the responsibilities imposed by distant merchants and the constant threat of rebellion. The very design of the ships, the arrangement of decks, the use of shackles, the division of men, women, and children reflected both an understanding of human psychology and a cold calculation of efficiency. Insurrections were met with brutal reprisals, yet they occurred with alarming frequency, a testament to the courage and resilience of those who refused to submit quietly. Each act of resistance, whether overt or subtle, challenged the authority of the captors and asserted the humanity that the trade sought to erase. As the voyage completed its cycle and ships returned to Europe carrying the fruits of their human and material cargo, the broader implications became clear. Economies were transformed, cultures were intertwined, and the very notions of race, power, and labor were reshaped. The triangular trade was a system that depended on the commodification of people, the exploitation of labor, and the extraction of resources, and it succeeded because it intertwined profit with violence, culture with coercion, and policy with prejudice. By tracing the flow of goods, the movement of human lives, and the intricate networks that sustained this trade, we begin to see not just the mechanics of history, but the lived experiences of those who endured its consequences. Their stories, often overlooked or simplified in textbooks, reveal the depth of suffering, the resilience of the human spirit, and the intricate web of connections that shaped the modern world. In exploring this passage of history, we are reminded that the wealth of empires, the rise of industries, and the patterns of global trade were built on human lives and human suffering. The triangular trade was not just a route on a map. It was a journey of countless individuals whose courage, resilience, and resistance continue to resonate across generations, demanding remembrance, understanding, and reflection on the complex interplay between commerce, power, and humanity. Long before the darkened hulls of the slave ships loomed on the horizon, the process of enslavement had already begun deep within the villages and towns of West Africa, where the rhythms of daily life were violently disrupted by the arrival of war, raids, and kidnappings. Families were torn apart in moments of chaos, often without warning, as rival groups sought captives to trade with European merchants, who had established networks along the coast to facilitate this grim commerce. In these violent encounters, the strongest and most able-bodied were usually taken first, but no one was truly safe. Women, the elderly, and most heartbreakingly, children were vulnerable to the merciless sweep of opportunistic captors. Children, too young to defend themselves or flee, were particularly susceptible, often seized in moments of play or while performing everyday tasks, their cries drowned out by the tumult of the raid. The trauma of these sudden separations was profound, a rupture of the bonds that had defined families, communities, and even cultural identities for generations. For those captured, the journey from inland villages to the coastal forts was itself a crucible of suffering, often lasting weeks or even months, and marked by exhaustion, hunger, and exposure to the elements. Handcuffed, bound, or shackled together, captives were driven along narrow paths, forced to march under scorching sun or relentless rain, sometimes beaten for the slightest sign of resistance. Many fell ill or perished during this trick, and those who survived were further demoralized by the knowledge that once they reached the coast, they would be thrust into a world far more foreign and unforgiving than any they had yet encountered. The psychological toll of this forced displacement was enormous. Individuals were ripped from the familiar sights, sounds, and smells of their homes and forced into a liminal space where the certainty of violence and uncertainty of survival became a daily reality. Even the bonds between those captured together were fragile, as fear, hunger, and the need for survival created tensions alongside fleeting moments of solidarity and mutual support. When the captives finally arrived at the coastal forts and trading posts, they entered a system meticulously engineered to extract maximum profit from human lives. Here, European merchants and local intermediaries evaluated, catalogued, and prepared them for the Middle Passage, often branding them, shaving their heads, and subjecting them to dehumanizing inspections that reduced individuals to commodities in the eyes of the traders. Children, small and fragile, were sometimes sold at lower prices, yet they held a particular value for buyers who saw in them both a malleable workforce and the potential to grow into adult laborers. The indignities they suffered at this stage were compounded by the fear of the unknown, the separation from loved ones, and the stories of cruelty that circulated among those already trapped within the system, leaving the youngest captives acutely aware of the peril that awaited them on the high seas. Even as they were confined to the holds of ships, chained and pressed against strangers, Africans drew on their inner reserves of resilience and ingenuity to maintain some measure of humanity. Older captives would comfort children, whispering songs and stories from home, teaching secret ways to communicate across the decks, or offering small gestures of reassurance that, however fleeting, provided a sense of continuity in a world designed to erase it. In some instances, captives observed, learned, and shared knowledge of the ship's routines, using it to plan small acts of defiance or even, in races, coordinated rebellions. These moments of courage were acts of survival, testaments to the indomitable spirit that persisted despite the systematic dehumanization they endured from capture to the final arrival in the Americas. The trauma of capture and transport also left indelible marks on the social structures and cultural fabric of the African communities from which the captives were taken. Entire villages lost generations of children, disrupting family lineages, labor systems, and communal practices that had sustained them for centuries. Traditions were interrupted, oral histories fragmented, and the knowledge of who had been taken, and how, became a silent wound carried through generations. In this way, the capture of Africans was not merely an individual tragedy but a collective one, altering the course of societies and reshaping the demographic, social, and cultural landscape of vast regions of West Africa. Understanding the vulnerability of children in this system underscores the profound cruelty of the Atlantic slave trade. These young lives were not only physically at risk, but were also subjected to the psychological terror of forced separation, the constant threat of violence, and the overwhelming uncertainty of survival. Their experiences remind us that slavery was not an abstract historical phenomenon, but a lived reality that devastated real people, often before they had fully known the world beyond their homes. In examining these early stages of capture, we gain insight into the mechanisms of power, fear, and control that underpinned the entire system of enslavement, revealing how the processes of warfare, raids, and kidnapping laid the foundation for the horrors of the Middle Passage and the dehumanization that awaited on the shores of the Americas. By tracing the journey from capture to forced embarkation, we not only witness the suffering endured, but also the remarkable resilience and resourcefulness of those who survived. Children learned quickly, adapted to new hierarchies, and, when possible, relied on the protection of elders. illustrating the persistence of familial and communal bonds even under conditions engineered to destroy them. This chapter of history challenges us to confront the full scope of human cruelty while honoring the courage and tenacity of the most vulnerable, ensuring that the youngest victims of the Atlantic slave trade are remembered not only for their suffering, but also for the resilience that carried them, in some form, through one of the darkest passages in human history. As the captives were loaded onto the slave ships, the air grew thick with the mingling odors of sweat, fear, and the unwashed bodies of hundreds of people pressed together in the confined wooden hulls designed for maximum profit rather than human dignity. And the journey that awaited them across the Atlantic was a trial of unimaginable suffering that tested both body and spirit in ways few could endure. Men were shackled in pairs, their movements restricted, their muscles stiffening from the constant tension of iron around their ankles and wrists. While women, though sometimes left unchained, were confined to their sections of the ship, unable to escape the constant oppression of their surroundings. And children, fragile and terrified, wandered within the narrow spaces, witnessing horrors that would mark their memories forever. The deck itself became a stage of torment where captives were segregated by age and gender, a system designed to prevent communication that could foster rebellion while simultaneously intensifying isolation and despair. There were no sanitation facilities, forcing the enslaved to relieve themselves wherever they could, creating a miasma that mingled with the heat of the tropical sun, the body odors of those around them, and the ever-present scent of sickness. And the stench was so pervasive that even seasoned sailors found it nearly unbearable. Yet the captives had no refuge. Disease spread with relentless speed, fed by overcrowding and malnutrition, and the crew often turned a blind eye to the suffering, attending only to their own well-being and the perceived value of the human cargo, measuring survival against profit margins rather than compassion. Dysentery, scurvy, yaws, and smallpox claimed lives daily, and those who became too weak were sometimes thrown overboard, a decision justified by the ship owners as necessary to protect the remainder of the cargo. Yet it revealed the profound moral corruption that underpinned the trade. Hunger was a constant companion. Rations were meager, often spoiled or insufficient, and captives were expected to endure the same harsh labor, maintain order when commanded, and navigate the physical rigors of the journey, all while their health deteriorated and hope diminished. The oppressive heat of the holds exacerbated suffering, as air scarcely circulated, leaving the enslaved drenched in their own sweat and gasping for relief that never came. And the wooden beams above trapped the warmth of the sun, intensifying the stifling environment that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Even amidst the darkness and confinement, the captives maintained traces of their humanity, singing songs from home in whispers, communicating through subtle gestures, and attempting to support one another through shared suffering. Yet the constant presence of violence made these moments fleeting and fragile. As the crew patrolled the decks with implements of control, whips, rods, and instruments designed to inflict pain, punishing the slightest perceived insubordination. Forced exercise, sometimes in the form of dance or song, was mandated for the amusement of the crew, or to keep the captives physically able to survive the journey. But it often became an additional mechanism of humiliation and cruelty, pushing already weakened bodies to the brink. Insanity and despair were common. Many fell into depression or attempted to end their own lives, choosing death over the unbearable conditions below deck. Yet even these acts were rarely mourned or recognized, treated instead as obstacles to be removed in the cold calculus of trade. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated, as captives were stripped not only of freedom but of identity, subjected to branding, shaving, and other dehumanizing practices meant to erase personal and cultural distinctions. Families were separated, friendships disrupted, and any sense of community was intentionally fractured to prevent rebellion, leaving individuals to navigate their suffering alone. Yet human resilience emerged in subtle ways. Small acts of kindness, the sharing of a morsel of food, the whispered encouragement to endure, and the preservation of memory through stories and song became acts of quiet resistance, assertions of personhood in a system that sought to eradicate it entirely. The endurance of these individuals, many of whom would survive to arrive in the Americas and face yet another system of oppression, stands as a testament to the capacity of the human spirit to withstand horrors that defy comprehension. As the voyage progressed, the lines between life and death blurred, and the boundaries between cruelty and survival became indistinguishable. For every decision made by the crew whether to ration water, enforce exercise, or punish defiance had life or death consequences. The overcrowded conditions amplified every risk, every disease outbreak, every altercation between captives, and the constant fear of violence created a pressure cooker of human suffering. And yet, even in these conditions, captives forged connections, learned to anticipate the movements of the crew, and occasionally mounted resistance or rebellion. Acts that, though often brutally suppressed, revealed a tenacity and courage that could not be extinguished. The Middle Passage, with its chains, segregated decks, filth, disease, and relentless heat, was not merely a journey across an ocean. It was a crucible in which humanity was both tested and asserted. A harrowing prelude to the new world that awaited, but one that could never fully erase the identities, cultures, and resilience of those who endured it. In understanding the conditions below deck, we grasp the magnitude of human suffering inflicted, the moral depravity of the system, and the extraordinary resilience of the captives, whose survival against such odds demands remembrance, empathy, and recognition of the indelible mark this chapter of history left on generations to come. The relentless passage across the Atlantic was a gauntlet of suffering where life and death were precariously balanced. And for many of the captives, survival was more a matter of chance than endurance. For the conditions on board the slave ships created a perfect storm in which disease, malnutrition, and systemic abuse converged to claim lives with horrifying regularity. And even those who demonstrated resilience were constantly under threat from both the physical environment and the merciless calculations of the crew and ship owners. Fever and dysentery spread swiftly through the cramped holds, where ventilation was minimal and the stench of human waste combined with the heat of the tropical sun to weaken bodies already depleted by insufficient food and the rigors of forced confinement. And the close quarters meant that illness rarely struck one in isolation. Contagion could pass silently from one captive to another, amplifying suffering and death with a speed that left little time for recovery or care. The captives, stripped of autonomy, were left to navigate the horrors of illness largely unaided, their pain often ignored or even exacerbated by the crew, who saw human life as a commodity rather than a sacred trust. And every death represented both a tragedy and a calculation, for insurance policies dictated how such losses were accounted for in the brutal economics of the trade. On many voyages, the crew faced strict financial incentives, as insurance would compensate for drowned captives but not for those who died from neglect, disease, or starvation, creating a chilling rationale for throwing the sick or dying overboard. Accounts from historical trials and first-hand testimonies recount how men, women, and children weakened by weeks at sea, ravaged by fever, and barely able to stand were cast into the ocean with little regard for their humanity. A practice justified legally by ship owners who argued that the cargo had to be preserved for the sake of the voyage. Yet the human cost was incalculable. Each life lost in this manner was a story extinguished, families torn apart, dreams destroyed, and the cultural knowledge of entire communities threatened with erasure. but the financial systems that underpinned the trade treated these deaths as simple numbers in ledgers. And the moral depravity of this arrangement left captives with no hope beyond mere survival. Malnutrition was another constant killer, as rations were deliberately meager to maximize profit, often consisting of watery porridge, salted fish, or other barely edible fare, while the physical demands of the voyage required strength that the captives were systematically denied. Starvation weakened their immune systems, making them more vulnerable to diseases that spread like wildfire below decks, and the relentless heat and humidity intensified the effects of hunger, dehydration, and infection. The sick, unable to defend themselves or move with any speed, became the targets of further cruelty. Some were beaten or punished, while others were simply discarded overboard. Their deaths both a relief to the captors in terms of cargo insurance and a terrifying signal to those who remained of the precariousness of life on the Middle Passage. The psychological terror of witnessing such acts, combined with the constant threat of disease and malnutrition, created a suffocating atmosphere of despair, and many captives succumbed not only to physical ailments but to hopelessness itself, their spirits eroded by the relentless oppression of their circumstances. Abuse was a daily reality, ranging from physical beatings to verbal intimidation, and it was often meted out indiscriminately, both to punish perceived disobedience and to maintain strict control over the enslaved population. Crew members wielded instruments designed to inflict maximum pain, and captives who were too weak to resist or too ill to comply were at the greatest risk of injury or death. Some accounts detail the routine use of whips, rods, and shackles to enforce order, while others recount the arbitrary and capricious nature of violence, which could strike without warning, leaving individuals traumatized and disoriented. The combination of abuse, disease, and malnutrition created a cascade of vulnerability, in which each hazard compounded the next, and captives were trapped in a cycle of suffering with almost no means of escape. Yet, amid this darkness, there were moments of resilience and fleeting acts of agency, as captives tried to support one another, share scarce resources, or maintain cultural and spiritual practices even in the confined and brutal environment of the holds. These acts were small, yet they signified a refusal to be entirely stripped of identity and humanity. Stories of resistance, whether in the form of organized revolts or quiet defiance, illustrate that even in the face of overwhelming mortality and cruelty, the enslaved maintained their agency where possible, asserting dignity in a system designed to erase it entirely. These acts of defiance, though sometimes punished severely, remind us that the history of the Middle Passage is not solely one of victimhood but also of courage, resilience, and the enduring spirit of human beings confronted with extreme oppression. Understanding the combined impact of disease, malnutrition, and abuse, along with the lethal policies enacted to protect insurance claims, allows us to grasp the full scale of the human suffering endured on these voyages. It also highlights the moral contradictions at the heart of the Atlantic slave trade, where profit was prioritized over life, where legality was twisted to justify atrocity, and where every ship carried a microcosm of human despair and defiance across the oceans. In recounting these harrowing experiences, we honor those who suffered and perished, and we bear witness to a chapter of history that demands both remembrance and reflection, reminding us of the consequences of dehumanizing systems and the enduring strength of those who endured them. Even in the midst of the most harrowing conditions aboard the slave ships, where chains bit into flesh, disease ravaged bodies, and malnutrition sapped the strength of those already weakened by fear and despair, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient, and despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, enslaved Africans often sought to reclaim agency through acts of defiance and rebellion that revealed not only courage but a profound refusal to be entirely broken by the system imposed upon them. And these moments of resistance, though sometimes small, illuminate a critical dimension of history that is often overshadowed by the narrative of suffering alone. One of the most remarkable examples of such resistance occurred aboard the Little George in June of 1730. When the ship departed the Guinea coast carrying 96 captives bound for Rhode Island, among these men, women, and children, a group of African men found ways to slip free from their shackles under the cover of darkness, quietly coordinating in whispers and gestures. Their understanding of one another and their shared knowledge of the ship's layout enabling them to plan an uprising with precision and stealth. As the crew remained unaware, the captives overpowered their guards, seizing weapons and asserting control over the deck, and in the violent confrontation that followed, several of the crew were killed while the rest were held captive. A stunning reversal of the power dynamics that had so systematically stripped these men of freedom and dignity. The Little George revolt culminated in an extraordinary act of navigation and courage as the captives sailed the ship back to the Sierra Leone River, returning to the very shores from which they had been stolen, and in doing so, they demonstrated not only the capacity for strategic thinking and collective action but also an unyielding desire for self-determination that could not be extinguished by chains or terror. Yet the story of rebellion did not end there, for similar uprisings occurred on many other voyages, each shaped by the particular circumstances of the voyage, the individuals involved, and the opportunities that presented themselves. In 1764, on a vessel departing from New London, Connecticut, enslaved Africans seized their chance while still in port, using clubs to subdue the crew and captain, after which they vanished into the surrounding communities and back to their homeland, leaving behind a testament to both their ingenuity and their unbreakable spirit. These incidents, though often unrecorded or minimally documented in contemporary accounts, speak volumes about the resilience, intelligence, and courage of the individuals forced into bondage. And they challenge the simplistic narrative of passivity that can dominate discussions of the Middle Passage. Revolts on slave ships were not merely spontaneous acts of desperation. They were carefully considered, often requiring clandestine communication and a deep understanding of the dynamics of the ship and its crew. Captives had to coordinate in secrecy, avoid detection, and manage both the psychological and physical barriers imposed by their oppressors, all while contending with hunger, illness, and exhaustion. The very act of planning an insurrection became a form of resistance, asserting human dignity against a system that sought to reduce people to mere commodities. And while many uprisings ended tragically, with severe reprisals or mass casualties among the captives, the courage displayed in these acts offers a counter-narrative to the relentless suffering, reminding us that even in the darkest conditions, the desire for freedom remained alive and fiercely protected. Furthermore, these rebellions had a broader significance beyond the immediate survival of those involved. They challenged the assumptions of invulnerability held by the captors, forced them to adjust strategies, and occasionally led to shifts in how enslaved people were treated or transported. However marginally, the fear of revolt was a constant presence, influencing everything from the design of the ships to the organization of captives below deck, and the psychological impact of such uprisings reverberated both among crews and among the wider networks of merchants and ship owners. Each successful revolt became a story to inspire others, a reminder that resistance was possible, and that humanity could not be fully extinguished even under the most oppressive circumstances. Even in the aftermath of failed revolts, where punishment was swift and brutal, captives often found subtle ways to assert agency, whether through maintaining cultural practices, quietly sharing food, preserving stories of home, or aiding one another in enduring the daily horrors of the voyage. These acts, though less visible than armed insurrection, were equally significant as they preserved human dignity and identity against relentless dehumanization. The Middle Passage, while a period of unimaginable suffering, was also a crucible in which resilience, courage, and solidarity were continuously tested and affirmed. And the stories of revolts like those on the Little George and the New London vessel serve as enduring reminders that the enslaved were never entirely powerless. Their actions echoing through history as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of systemic cruelty. By understanding these uprisings not merely as episodes of violence, but as profound assertions of freedom and humanity, we gain insight into the complexity of resistance during the Atlantic slave trade, recognizing that even when lives were lost and suffering persisted, the spirit of defiance remained, shaping the legacy of resilience that would carry forward into future generations and illuminate the indomitable will of those who refused to be silenced or broken. Amid the crushing horror of the Middle Passage, the experiences of women and children revealed both the profound vulnerability imposed by the system of slavery and the extraordinary resourcefulness that some were able to summon in order to survive. As women were subjected not only to the physical deprivations and violent treatment that all captives endured but also to the persistent threat of sexual exploitation, a grim reality that added another layer of terror to their confinement. And children, stripped of any capacity to protect themselves, were often exposed to illness, malnutrition, and violence, their innocence offering no shield from the brutal calculus of profit that governed every aspect of the voyage. Women were frequently relegated to the lower status spaces aboard the ships, their freedom of movement limited despite not being shackled like the men, and in those confined quarters, they had to navigate not only the omnipresent threat of disease and filth, but also the intentions of crew members who regarded them as objects to be controlled, manipulated, or exploited. Some women, however, demonstrated remarkable cunning, finding ways to leverage perceptions of their vulnerability or to negotiate small concessions in food, space, or protection, turning the limited agency afforded to them into a means of survival in circumstances designed to strip them of all power. The strategies employed by women to endure the voyage were as varied as they were inventive, ranging from subtle forms of resistance, such as feigning compliance or strategically aligning with certain crew members, to more overt actions intended to shield themselves or their children from immediate harm. This delicate balancing act required constant vigilance, an acute awareness of the intentions of those around them, and an ability to act decisively in moments where hesitation could mean severe punishment or even death. Children, often forced to observe these survival strategies while contending with their own vulnerabilities, developed an awareness of danger and learned, in the most brutal of schools, the early lessons of caution, resilience, and the fragile importance of alliances even in the smallest forms. These experiences created a microcosm of human interaction defined by both oppression and ingenuity, as the captives navigated a hierarchy imposed by the crew that sought to maintain control through fear, violence, and strict segregation. And yet within these imposed boundaries, women and children continuously adapted, finding ways to endure, protect, and, when possible, assert small measures of agency that could mean the difference between life and death. Sexual abuse, while often underreported in contemporary accounts, was a grim reality that shaped daily life for many women aboard the ships, compounding the already extreme physical and psychological stresses of the Middle Passage, and the presence of children intensified the stakes, as mothers struggled to shield them from exposure to violence and illness while also trying to secure enough sustenance to survive themselves. In some cases, women turned the perceptions and assumptions of the crew to their advantage, using intelligence, negotiation, or even deception to create moments of reprieve, such as obtaining slightly better rations or avoiding direct confrontation at critical moments. These actions, born from necessity and survival instinct, reveal a dimension of resistance that is often overlooked: the capacity of the vulnerable to navigate a system explicitly designed to dehumanize and dominate, finding spaces in which to assert dignity, protect loved ones, or simply survive another day at sea. Accounts from historical records, including testimony from survivors and observations documented by European observers, describe the precarious existence of women and children aboard these vessels, where a single misstep could trigger harsh punishment. And yet amid the filth, heat, and terror, women cultivated resilience, sometimes forming informal networks of support, offering protection to one another, and exchanging crucial knowledge about coping strategies that might increase the likelihood of survival. These small acts of solidarity, though easily overlooked in the broader narrative of the Middle Passage, played a vital role in sustaining life, morale, and human connection, illustrating that even under the most dehumanizing conditions, communal bonds and the exercise of ingenuity could provide a lifeline. Children, for their part, endured the compounded vulnerabilities of age and circumstance, often witnessing acts of cruelty directed at their mothers, siblings, or fellow captives, and yet many adapted in ways that allowed them to survive, learning from the behaviors of the adults around them, understanding subtle signals of danger, and, in some instances, participating in small acts of resistance or evasion that reflected a nascent but critical sense of agency within an environment that sought to suppress all forms of self-determination. The interactions between women and children, the strategies employed to navigate sexual abuse, disease, and deprivation, and the continuous negotiation of physical and psychological threats together form a tapestry of endurance, creativity, and courage that challenges simplified portrayals of passivity, emphasizing instead the dynamic, responsive, and often ingenious ways in which the most vulnerable coped with conditions designed to annihilate both body and spirit. By examining the particular experiences of women and children during the Middle Passage, we gain a deeper understanding of the nuanced human responses to extreme oppression, the ways in which intelligence, cunning, and solidarity could become essential survival tools, and the enduring impact of these early experiences on collective memory, resilience, and the preservation of cultural identity. These narratives remind us that even within a system structured for exploitation and dehumanization, the oppressed were not merely passive victims. They were active participants in the struggle to maintain dignity, protect one another, and survive under circumstances that would have crushed the unprepared, offering enduring lessons about courage, ingenuity, and the capacity of the human spirit to resist even in the most harrowing conditions. When the battered vessels finally reached the shores of the Americas after weeks or even months of relentless suffering, the ordeal of the Middle Passage did not end with disembarkation. For the survivors, many of whom had lost family, friends, and their sense of home, were immediately subjected to a process designed to strip away every trace of their previous identities and humanity. As they were herded onto the docks or into holding pens where traders and auctioneers moved with practiced efficiency to assess, clean, and prepare them for sale, a ritual both mechanical and deeply dehumanizing that reduced men, women, and children to commodities whose value was determined by physical condition, age, and perceived labor potential. And yet within this grim calculus of commerce, each individual carried memories of loss, resistance, and the faint, lingering threads of cultural identity that could not be entirely erased. The captives, whose bodies bore the marks of chains, disease, and malnutrition, were scrubbed and greased, often with palm oil or other substances intended to make their skin appear smoother and healthier. A cosmetic gesture that masked the profound suffering they had endured, but did nothing to address the trauma that weighed upon them. while simultaneously reinforcing the perception that they were objects to be presented and inspected rather than human beings with histories, families, and voices of their own. Children, particularly vulnerable, were sometimes held close to mothers or older relatives. Yet even this protective instinct could not shield them from the mechanical and transactional nature of the auction process, where familial bonds were often severed with the stroke of a gavel, leaving them strangers in a world that had become entirely alien. Auctioneers and buyers, trained in the cold calculus of commerce, inspected the captives with the same detached scrutiny applied to livestock. Checking teeth, musculature, and signs of illness, and as the crowd gathered, voices called out prices, bids, and instructions, further erasing the individual identities of those being sold, while the survivors, already drained by the horrors of the voyage, were forced to absorb the full weight of their subjugation, a psychological torment compounded by the knowledge that their lives were now entirely controlled by the will of others. In this environment, a subtle, almost imperceptible resistance persisted, as individuals clung to names, whispered stories, maintained cultural gestures, or shared knowledge of foods, songs, and prayers, all acts, though small, allowed a fragment of identity to survive amid the overwhelming effort to reduce them to property. The transition from ship to shore represented not only a geographical displacement, but a profound social and cultural dislocation. For once purchased, the captives were integrated into plantation systems, urban households, or other labor structures in which they were immediately regarded as outsiders, alien to the rhythms, customs, and languages of the new societies into which they were forcibly inserted, and yet their lived experience, the endurance of their cultures, and the quiet acts of preservation and adaptation enabled the gradual formation of diasporic communities whose resilience and cohesion would influence generations to come. Adult men and women often found ways to establish networks of mutual support, negotiating the brutal expectations of labor, punishment, and oversight, and in some instances, turning perceived vulnerabilities into means of protection or subtle empowerment. While children, observing and learning, began to absorb both the mechanics of survival and the enduring traces of cultural memory that had traveled across the ocean with them. This phase of forced assimilation, characterized by public sales, assignment to labor, and the imposition of new identities, was also a psychological battleground, as the survivors had to reconcile memories of their homelands, family ties, and acts of resistance with the new realities of enslavement, in which their personhood was continually questioned or outright denied. The stripping of names, the application of new labels, and the categorization of humans by age, health, and gender functioned as a mechanism of control, designed to sever connections to past lives and impose a rigid hierarchy in which autonomy and agency were systematically suppressed. Yet even in these circumstances, the human capacity for adaptation and resilience was remarkable, as individuals cultivated strategies to endure, to communicate covertly, and to maintain traces of self and community that could not be fully extinguished. As the captives were assigned to their new owners, transported across plantations or households, and thrust into grueling labor under the watchful eyes of overseers, the social marginalization they experienced reinforced their outsider status, creating layers of isolation, alienation, and surveillance that the enslaved had to navigate with constant caution and ingenuity. Despite the severity of these conditions, bonds formed among captives, friendships, kinship-like alliances, and shared cultural practices allowed for the survival of language, song, and spiritual traditions. And in these acts of shared endurance, a sense of humanity and continuity persisted. countering the dehumanizing intent of the system that sought to reduce them to mere property. The experience of being prepared for sale, transported into alien communities, and treated as outsiders illuminates the continuity of suffering from capture to forced labor, revealing the systemic nature of oppression and the multifaceted challenges faced by those who survived the Middle Passage. And yet it also highlights the remarkable adaptability, strength, and resilience of human beings confronted with unimaginable adversity. Understanding this phase of the journey underscores the importance of acknowledging the full scope of historical trauma, the strategies of resistance and survival employed by the enslaved, and the enduring legacies of identity, community, and resilience that emerged despite systematic efforts to erase them, reminding us that even in circumstances designed to annihilate individuality, the human spirit persists, quietly asserting itself in ways that can endure across generations. As we draw this harrowing journey to a close, it is impossible to overlook the staggering human cost of the transatlantic slave trade, a system that uprooted millions of Africans from their homes, subjected them to unimaginable suffering aboard slave ships, and stripped them of identity, agency, and freedom upon arrival in the Americas, leaving scars that reverberate across generations. The stories we have explored of the Middle Passage's cruelty, the physical and psychological torment endured by men, women, and children, the acts of resistance and cunning that allowed some to survive, and the persistent struggle to preserve identity and culture represent only a fraction of the untold narratives that remain buried in the history of slavery. Yet they speak volumes about the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of communities in the face of oppression, and the courage of those who refuse to be fully broken. The slave trade was not merely a historical event. It was a deliberate, systematic exercise of power that relied on dehumanization, racial hierarchies, and economic incentives to justify its brutality. Every detail we have uncovered: the cramped and unsanitary conditions of the ships, the separation of families, the exploitation and abuse of women and children, the revolts aboard vessels, and the subsequent treatment of survivors as property demonstrates the lengths to which human cruelty was institutionalized. Yet it also illuminates the extraordinary acts of endurance and ingenuity that allowed individuals to navigate this terrifying system. By remembering these events, we honor the millions who perished in silence and those who endured unimaginable suffering, ensuring that their experiences are not erased or forgotten. Understanding this history is crucial not only to acknowledge past atrocities, but also to reflect on how systems of power, oppression, and racial discrimination continue to influence our world today. The legacies of the transatlantic slave trade are visible in social inequalities, systemic racism, and ongoing struggles for justice, reminding us that the stories of the past are inextricably linked to the present. Yet, within these narratives of suffering, we also find profound lessons about resilience, how communities preserved culture, language, and faith, how individuals found ways to survive through intelligence and solidarity, and how resistance, both subtle and overt, served as a testament to human dignity under extreme oppression. As you reflect on this story, it is important to consider the courage required to endure, the creativity needed to survive, and the compassion necessary to support one another even in the direst circumstances. These lessons extend beyond the historical moment of the slave trade, offering guidance for how we confront injustice today, by bearing witness, amplifying silenced voices, and ensuring that the narratives of marginalized communities are honored and preserved. Every act of acknowledgement, every effort to educate, and every commitment to justice helps to transform the painful legacy of history into a source of insight and empathy for future generations. We invite you, our viewers, to take a moment to internalize the weight of these stories, to share this knowledge with others, and to reflect on how the resilience, resistance, and enduring humanity of those who suffered under slavery can inspire us to challenge oppression, wherever it persists. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel so that we can continue to bring these important stories to light. By doing, you help keep history alive, ensuring that the lessons and legacies of the past are not forgotten, and that the voices of those who endured so much are honored in our collective memory. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for engaging with this story, as acknowledging the pain and perseverance of the enslaved is an essential step toward understanding our shared human history. May we all remember, reflect, and carry forward the lessons of resilience, courage, and dignity. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with hope, empathy, and a commitment to a more just and compassionate world.